Hi there. Welcome to our first in the CSEC English A story writing tips. I am language professora, and I know that usually you're accustomed to hearing me saying hola, but this time around we're talking about English language, okay? So Spanish is for another time really, but let's get into it. So I'm going to be doing this story writing series in 4 parts at least. What I want to do first of all is have a sort of introduction to the whole topic of story writing from a CSEC perspective. For those of you who are not from the Caribbean, you may be wondering, what is she talking about? CSEC is, I would call it, our Caribbean-based external or exit examinations for our high school students. And they have those exams coming up in a few weeks, actually. And English A, or English language, is one of the subjects that tends to be a bit problematic for students. So we're going to be looking at story writing, which is a problem topic. We're going to be doing this in 4 parts, as I said. In part 1, we're going to be looking at the elements of a short story, especially the one that has to be written in the exam. In part 2, we're going to be looking at a sample of a short story, perhaps a fairy tale, and seeing how the elements of a story find themselves in that short story. For part 3, we're going to be looking at an actual CSEC exam question and breaking it down in terms of the preparation for writing that story. And then in part 4, we're going to actually write the short story. So if you are one of those students who knows that English is not your strong point, let's get started. Now, before you actually start writing your story, there are some things in the story called elements of the story that you need to be aware of. You may have heard some of these terms floating around. Right now, we're going to be going into some more detail regarding these terms. Now, the first 4 elements that we always hear about are the plot, setting, character, and theme. We always hear these terms floating around, but what do they really mean? The plot, I like to break it down like this. You know, you have your 5 W's of writing: who, what, where, when, why. So I like to break down these 4 elements and spread them across those 5. So the plot is what? Your setting has 2 components. It's where the story takes place and when the story takes place. So where, of course, would be the place, and when would be the time. And we're going to discuss these in a little bit more detail in a bit. The character would be who is in the story, and the theme, to some extent, would be why, or what is the lesson that you're learning from the story, okay? Now, with the plot, we're going to be breaking this down some more as well. With the plot, when we talk about what is happening in the story, we want to ensure that our story is not flat, because if it's flat, it's really not a story. A story really and truly is more like a narrative. And if you think about a good movie that you have watched, that is a story. And I want you to think about a good movie. Let's stay on that for a little while. I want you to think about a good movie that you have watched. And What is it that has you sitting down, watching that movie for up to 2 hours, possibly? There is a particular channel, I will not call the name because I don't know if there'll be a problem putting it on this forum, but there's a particular channel where the movies are pretty predictable. You can basically tell when the movie begins that you're going to have this opening sequence. Then for the other maybe 3/4 of the movie, you're going to have a number of things that are adding to what you said, or what you saw rather, in the opening sequence. Then maybe half an hour to 20 minutes before the movie ends, you're going to have a high point. Maybe there's a chase, maybe someone is holding someone at ransom with a knife or a gun. We don't know what the possibilities are, but there is that high point. And then shortly after that high point, everything unfolds. Maybe someone gets stabbed, maybe someone gets knocked out, maybe the police come rushing into the rescue, whatever the case may be. But after that high point, everything basically just dwindles down, and everything comes to a fitting end. Now, those points in that movie can be applied to story writing, and the plot encapsulates the what of your story. So all of what I just said about the movie, that will be a plot. Now, a good plot is one that would keep the readers engaged. In the plot, and I'm going to change color here just for distinction. In the plot, there are 3 main things that you're going to see happening. You must have a conflict. And when I spoke about something happening in the opening sequence of the movie, it's a problem. Something is happening that needs some sort of solution, right? A conflict. Then that high point that I spoke of is your climax. This is the point at which something has got to give, something has to change. And then shortly after the climax, where everything is wrapping up, that is where you have your resolution taking place, right? So with the plot of the story, this is pretty much the backbone of the story, and it guides these 3. The plot is behind your setting, because depending on the nature of the story that you're outlining, that would determine, the plot rather would determine where the story is taking place, when it is taking place. It would also determine who is in the story, right? So your plot is very important. Now, if your plot doesn't have these 3 elements clearly defined, you're going to run into a bit of a problem. And what you might end up with is maybe a narrative or a reflective piece rather than a story, because the story has to have a conflict, it has to have a climax, it has to have that sense of things happening that will hold the reader, that will engage the reader in your story. And remember, from the CSEC perspective, you have roughly 400 to 500 words to impress the examiner. And you want to ensure that coming out of the gate, from the very beginning, that opening sequence grabs their attention, right? So let's continue looking at these in a summary form. And then I'm going to turn the page and I'm going to go into more detail with your conflict, your climax, and your resolution. But the setting now, the setting is the place where the story takes place. That sounded funny a while ago, the place where the story takes place. Anyway, but the setting of your story is the location pretty much. Now, when it comes on to story writing, your imagination is as wide and as wild as you want it to be. Typically, when you're writing a story, depending on the stimulus that you're given in the exam, you might be using the picture, and sometimes the picture has the place already depicted. So that's already set for you. Sometimes it's just a title. Sometimes it's a line that you need to use somewhere in the story. The question might say, use it at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end. It might stipulate where, or it might leave it up to you where you put it. Nevertheless, those kind of determine how you set your story in terms of the place. But I want to point this out. The place can be anywhere you want it to be. It can be a physical place in terms of a country, a house, a building. It can be a mythical place in terms of another planet. It can be an unusual place. Maybe you want your story to be underwater, in the top of a tree, on top of a cloud. Anywhere you want your story to be, it's fine by you because it's your story. As long as it falls in line with the stimulus that you've been given, it is your story, okay? As to the time now, for the time, we can think about time from the perspective of your literal clock time. So it's 11:59 a.m. It's 7 p.m. You can also think about time in terms of your time of year. So it's summer, it's spring, it's November, it's January, whatever time of year it can be. So it can be, let's review that quickly. It can be time of day, it can be time of year. We can also think about time in terms of era, right? And when I speak about era, right now we're in 2021. Your story in terms of the time can be set in 1821. It would mean that you'd have to be careful to ensure that the things that you're putting in the story fall in line and are consistent with the time that you've chosen. So if you are setting your story in 1821, for argument's sake, you can't have your characters being dressed in jeans and t-shirt, because jeans and t-shirt was not the mode of attire at that point in time, in that era. You can't have your characters having cell phones or tablets or laptops, because those things were not a part of the everyday activity in that era. So you have to be very careful when it comes on to time. So time, again, let's look at it. We're talking about, I will call it the clock time. So that's maybe the 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, whatever the case may be. We're talking about also your calendar time. So time of year. I'm not sure why my pen is glitching like this. Do forgive me, I'll try to fill in accordingly. And we can also talk about your era in terms of your period, your centuries, your decades, whatever the time period is. Let's move on to the characters. Now, the characters, ladies and gentlemen, they are also a driving force in your story. You tend to have a main character. You tend to have minor characters who are supporting that main character. Now, the character or the characters are who you will find driving the conflict in the story. And we're coming back to this word conflict because there's another further breakdown for that. But the characters are the persons who tend to have the conflict that drive the story eventually. All right? Now, your characters, again, would have to come in to the picture in terms of the dialogue that they're going to be having with each other, what they're going to be revealing about themselves as they go through the story. And your characters ultimately need to be believable. They need to be authentic. They need to be credible in a way. Now, let's think outside the box once again. Your characters don't always have to be human. Your characters can be animals. Your characters can be trees. Depending on how you have decided to have your story unfold, your characters can be whoever or whatever you want them to be. Suppose you get a picture, and in the picture there is this big tree, and you have other things happening, but you have this big tree, and you choose to have the big tree be the main character, and then everything else unfolds around the big tree. It's up to you. It's your imagination. Use it wisely. Then the theme would be now the overall moral of the story, what lessons are being learned in the story, so to speak. ultimately the theme from the CSEC perspective would be how well the story fits in with the stimulus that you were given. Okay, so we're going to be taking a look now at our conflict. Let me just change pages. Let's take a deeper look at conflict. Let's get this out of the way. Now, there are three types of conflict that you can find in a story. And the conflict is a case where it can be one of two things. Well, let me not say one of two things. It could actually be a case where in the one story, you have all of these conflicts coming into play. And that's quite okay, depending on how you structure them. So the first kind of conflict, I'm going to change my colors yet again. First kind of conflict, and remember now, the conflict is driven by the character, okay? So the first kind of conflict that you'll find with your characters is when they have a conflict with self, or what we call an internal conflict. Now, when we think about conflict, we have conflicts every day. So first of all, I want to get this straight. When we talk about conflict in a story, we're not talking about fist to fist and a fight, a physical fight. No, we're simply talking about choices, decisions, something that the character has to make a choice between. And we have conflicts every day. Just a simple example is, I may have a conflict between, okay, do I stay up and record this video for the students, or do I go and do something else? Once I have to make a choice of some sort, that's a conflict. So your characters can have conflict with themselves or internal conflict. So in your story, you might have your character trying to decide if they should wear the jeans or wear the skirt. That's a conflict, right? Now, the extent to which that conflict is important or not important in your story depends on what importance or what weight that conflict can carry in the story. But that's the first type of conflict, conflict with self. Then you have your second type of conflict. And this is where your characters interact. And this is now conflict with others. So this is the one that we tend to be most familiar with, where one character is at odds or at loggerheads with another character. So this is the one that we're most familiar with, and that's the one that we tend to use a lot. So you have one character who wants to go to a play, another character doesn't want to go, and they are having that bit of a challenge back and forth between each other or among themselves, depending on the number of characters that you have. And then the third one is conflict with nature. Now, conflict with self is an internal conflict. Conflict with others and conflict with nature are external conflicts. And the thing with these external conflicts are, one of them is controllable, and the other is uncontrollable. And I'm going to give a little example of this. Let us say that there is a young man who is courting a young lady and they want to go on a date. He is known for being tardy. He's known for being late. And so as a result, he has to ensure that he does what he needs to get done in order to not be late for this date with this young lady. So first of all, he's at home, he's trying to decide what to wear. Should I wear my green shirt? Should I wear my purple shirt? The mere fact that he has some sort of decision or choice that he has to make, that is a conflict with himself. Now, let us say that he's now ready for the date and it's time for him to jump into his car and go. When he gets outside, he realizes that he has a flat tire. His brother's car is right there. He goes to his brother, he asks his brother, can you lend me your keys to go on a date with this young lady? His brother decides, no, I'm not going to lend you my keys. That is now where you have a conflict with others. You have a decision or a choice to make, and there's a problem, right? So to lend him the keys or not, the brother would have had an internal conflict to say, should I lend him the keys or shouldn't I? The last time I lent him my car, he got a scratch on it. This time I'm not going to lend him. He had that internal conflict before he decided, no, I'm not lending you the keys. Okay, let us say that eventually he convinced him to lend him the car. And he gets into the car. When he's on his way now to pick up the young lady, there's an accident. And there is no other detour, he's stuck in traffic. Now that is something that he can't control. That's an external force, nature, environment, whatever you want to call it, coming into the picture and disrupting the flow of things that he would have had in order to get to the date with the young lady. So that very simple example sort of breaks down the three types of conflict. You can have those three types of conflict occurring in your story, and it should not be a problem depending on how you weave them in and out of each other. I want to make sure that I am covering everything. So I have two more things that I want to say on this matter before I wrap up this video. All right, so let's change page again. So let's now talk about the narrator. The narrator in your story. The narrator is the person or persons doing the talking, right? Now, in story writing, you have what are called POVs. And if you read ebooks, I'm trying not to call the name of the website just in case there's a problem. But there's a particular website that young people love, and you'll see a lot of the stories on this website using POV or point of view. So here now you have your first person POV, your third person POV, and you have third person having three further breakdowns, right? Now with the first person, this is where the narrator is in the story and speaking from what is called a first person perspective. So they're speaking from the I, the we, the our, the my, and everything that you're seeing in the story is unfolding through this one character's eyes only. Now, if you're reading some of those stories on that particular website, these are novels, novellas, and you'll frequently see this first person POV switching between the main characters. But the essence of the first person POV is that you're seeing it from just that one character's eyes, and it tends to be limited. If I was in a physical class, I would say, class, why do you think the first person narrator is a limited narrator? But since I'm not in a physical class and I don't expect any physical answers through the screen, I'm going to just tell you. The first person narrator is said to be limited because he or she is only seeing things from where they sit. So let us say that you're writing a story about a house on fire. And in that house, you have 5 rooms. And the first person narrator is in one of the rooms. That narrator can only speak about what they are experiencing in that one room. They can't speak for anyone else except themselves. So they may get out of the house and they may be looking up at the house and they see everybody else coming out of the house, but they can't say how they got out. They can only share their experience. So that is why this first person narrator is said to be limited in a sense. Now, the third person narrator, this is where we get into the they, them, you all. And this is called the omniscient narrator. Omniscient means all knowing. So this is the narrator who basically has an edge over the first person because they know everything. So they are like from the outside looking in. They are looking down and seeing what everyone is doing. So they're able to talk about what person 1 is doing in the kitchen, what person 2 is doing in the living room, what person 3 is doing in the bedroom, what person 4 is doing in the bathroom, and so on and so forth. They can speak from everyone's point of view. That's the omniscient narrator. Now, the omniscient narrator can also be, or the third person narrator can also be the third person narrator and be speaking from just one perspective. The difference though with the third person from just one perspective rather, and the first person is that they're going to be using the third person pronouns. So they're going to be using the you, they, and all of those other pronouns. The only thing is that they are just saying all of that or recounting the information from just one person's perspective. But it's not a matter of being a first person. And then you have the third person narrator. I think I mixed something up. I don't need this one again because I already discussed this one. All right. So the third person from all sides or the omniscient, and the third person from just one perspective or just from one side, but still third person because they're giving you that third person feel of things. So in a nutshell, these are your narrators. Now, how does this come into your CSEC English exam? One of the things that you need to take a very good look at when you are trying to decide on your narrator in your story is the phrasing of the stimulus. So, well, if you're using the picture, then you don't really need to think about that. You can decide if you're going to use a first person narrator or a third person narrator. But if in the stimulus, you see pronouns like I, me, my, us, our, you see words like that, it tells you, okay, this line has to be in the story somewhere, and it's not in a dialogue, so it must mean that the narrator has to be first person. Versus if you see them or she or he or they, then you can say to yourself, okay, so that means that this narrator can be a third person or an omniscient narrator. So the wording or the phrasing of the question is very important. I have just one more thing to say, and then we're going to wrap this up completely in a nice, neat bundle. And this one thing is just to show you basically how your story should progress. So here we have a line. I don't know how straight I'll get it, but here we have a line, okay? Let's just say that your story begins here. That's where your story begins. And as your story progresses, remember those 3 things that we looked at: conflict, climax, and resolution? I didn't really touch on climax and resolution because I was so caught up in the conflict, but I digress. Your story begins. Now, shortly after, not very long after your story begins, you must introduce, and I'm writing the wrong thing, you must introduce your conflict. Must. How do you think you're going to get the attention of your readers? Think about the movie once again. If within the first 5 to 10 minutes of the movie, you don't have a reason to actually sit and watch the movie, you're going to move on. So you must introduce your conflict practically almost immediately. So right after you have introduced your characters, your setting, your time and place, given a basic synopsis of what may be happening, then you want to introduce your conflict. So notice how it goes up from the start to the conflict. Now, along the different points, you have to have something that is going to keep the reader engaged. Think again about a movie. At different points in the movie, there is something that keeps you watching. And so just when you think the conflict is going to be resolved, something happens. Then you go along again and you think it's going to be fixed. No, something else happens. And it keeps building and building and building. Now, these points are suspense. And the suspense speaks to just when you think they're going to resolve this conflict, something else happens. So you want to think about ensuring that your story has sufficient suspense. Now, when the suspense gets to a point where it can't go any further, that is where you have your climax, the highest point of your story. And then notice now in the timeline where it is, very close to the end, shortly after your climax, where everything wraps up, that is where you have your resolution. So, with all of that being said, let us do a quick recap in terms of story writing. You have your elements in terms of your plot, your setting, your characters, and your theme. Your plot is what happens in the story. Your setting is where it happens, when it happens in terms of the time. Your characters are who are in your story, and your, what am I leaving out? Your theme is basically the moral or the message in your story. We also looked a little bit more at the conflict because that is really the main driving force behind your story. You must have a conflict, something that needs to be resolved somehow. And with that conflict, you have 3 types of conflict that your characters can have. They can have an internal conflict. They can have conflict with others. Both of those are controllable. But then ultimately, they can have conflict with nature or the environment or something that they cannot control. Then we have our climax, the highest point of our story. And when we look at our example in terms of the fairy tale that we're going to be looking at in the next video, we're going to see how the climax comes into play along with the resolution. Then we took a look at our narrators, and we have our first-person narrator, and then we have 2 types of third-person narrator. We have the first third-person narrator, which is your omniscient narrator, your all-knowing narrator, the narrator that speaks in the story from every point of view. Then you also have your third-person narrator who speaks from one point of view. That is not as limited as the first person in a sense. Okay, and then we looked at our story timeline, where the story begins, the conflict right after the story begins, the suspense points, the climax, the highest point in the story, and the resolution. So, in a nutshell, tell me what you think about this little snippet, this little synopsis of story writing, and how useful do you think it's going to be for your upcoming exams? Until we look at the next video, have a good one. See you in a few.